let's kick off initial thoughts for the panel. Let's kick off by asking each of our panel members, what is the one thing that stood out for you the most in this year's budget? Why don't we start with Robyn?
Yeah, thanks, John. In the last 2 months, since 17th of March, I've basically spent a lot of my time talking about wage subsidies. So I think the extension to the wage subsidy scheme was definitely the standout for me. I'm lucky enough that my name is associated with wage subsidies on the Deloitte website. So I've received numerous, probably hundreds of phone calls from complete strangers asking me questions about wage subsidies. And I mean, it's clear to me that there's a lot of need for that. So from my perspective, it's really great to see an extension to that scheme. Obviously, an extra 8 weeks of potential questions from strangers. Great to look forward to. I think some of the changes to that, in particular, the change to reduce the increase the revenue decline threshold to 50% is a sensible one, just to make sure that it is more targeted to the businesses that are in need. Still a lot of money that they're proposing to spend on it, so the additional $3.2 billion. So it'll be interesting to see whether or not there are some further tweaks that are just made to ensure that it is targeted where the need is. So with the current regime, it does apply to the self-employed as well as employers. So I'd be interested to see whether or not there's any tightening on how it applies to the self-employed, because we haven't actually seen any sort of transparency on that, other than we know that there's 219,000 people that have got it. But from my perspective, that's where the risk sits with the scheme in terms of money potentially going out the door when it's not necessarily needed. If you're self-employed, it's potentially easier to manipulate your way to a 50% decline in revenue by just choosing not to work. So yeah, wage subsidies for me.
Okay, thanks very much, Robyn. Heather, what about you?
Sorry, guys, had trouble with the mute button, but of course it wouldn't be a Zoom call without a mute button problem. For me, I think the standout has been the apprenticeship scheme, the retraining there. I think if you could criticise this budget for anything, in a major way, it would be the lack of vision. I mean, I think that's understandable given the fact that we're still in the middle of a crisis. And, the point that I make is that the Australians delayed their budget for exactly the reason that, it's really hard to get a handle on exactly how this is playing out. So to expect our finance minister to be able to see how to handle this thing into the future is probably a bit optimistic. But the lack of vision is there. This seems to me to be the only thing that kind of hints at some kind of real vision. So I was very happy to see that. I would like to make mention also of, and by the way, of course, fees free, not a huge fan of it, but that was then, this is now, and I think I can kind of see the value in it at the moment in the middle of a crisis. Definitely the $20 billion as well, that is still in the back pocket, is a huge amount of money, and I think the temptation there will be to drop the fiscal discipline, and it is our job to really keep an eye on these guys and make sure that they are really, really disciplined with that spending going forward. Thanks,
Heather. Brad?
Yeah, I'm going to take a slightly different approach. My key takeaway was that it was comprehensive. There were a huge number of quite big announcements that came out. And that's different from a lot of budgets where there's normally sort of one or two standouts. And so that comprehensive package was the thing that got me. The government's come out very quickly, in fact, to sort of announce some of these projects, some of them only being signed off, I think, on Monday. So I guess going to Heather's point, a lack of detail and a lack of vision in some respects. But in my mind, it does set quite a strong foundation as we move forward. The greatest point I think we need to be hesitant of is seeing this as a recovery budget. It's not a recovery budget yet. It's still in many respects a response budget. We're still sort of seeing the economy creak and groan as it reorientates itself, as we see people lose jobs. This will keep more people in there. It will start to get a few more people back into employment, but we haven't sort of seen what those structural changes are going to be and how the government wants to redefine what the economy is in the future.
Thanks, Brad. Kirk, over to you.
Yeah, well, I mean, I broadly agree with actually the sentiments being expressed. I'll just cover off and reiterate what Heather said in terms of the skills package. $120 million for free trades training in critical industries, $412 million support for employers to retain and keep training their apprentices. So the pipeline of skills stays in the system, really critical, because the worst thing is you've got all these shovel-ready products and projects ready to go, except no one to do them. So keeping those apprentices in jobs now is really important. Quite a lot of money for, Maori apprenticeships funds. So again, really using the levers of government to deal with some employment inequities. I would broadly agree that that this is very much a here and now budget. Actually, there wasn't much vision stuff in it. I do think we'll expect to see a bit more of that as we get a bit closer to the election. Of course, there is that small matter of the election. So yeah, I mean those would be my comments on it.
Thanks, guys. Let's move on now. The budget has been branded as a rebuilding together budget. I mean, even before COVID-19 hit the headlines, people had their to-do list prepared for the budget as to-do list or wish list, whether it was housing, transport, water, green energy, or anchor projects in the provinces. Now we've had an economy to rebuild. There's much to talk about stimulus projects. So, Brad, let's start with you. How did Grant Robinson do from that perspective? Is the budget done enough to restart the economy and lift business confidence?
Look, I think it's a good start, but it is very much we are in that response phase. I mean, I think it's quite incredible to see just how much work has gone in to prepare this budget. Again, a lot of initiatives that have come through quite quickly, a lot of thinking on the fly, I expect, and I guess it's good to see that when we often have policy on the hoof, it doesn't always work out well. I think a lot of these seem to have a little bit more success going in them. I guess whether or not it's going to restart the economy and has injected confidence into businesses, I'm a bit more circumspect about that. Talking to a lot of SMEs yesterday, they were disappointed that there doesn't seem to be anything coming through in terms of addressing some of those cash flow issues we know that many have. And I guess in that respect, it was focused on jobs and it was focused on employees. I think that employers might still find it a little bit of a struggle moving forward. Essentially, the only options they seem to have is to take on more debt. Now, the government can do that and hold it for a lot longer than businesses seem to. And I guess that's one of the concerns. As we get going and as we reimagine what the economy has to do, I think what Grant Robertson has done really well and is quite a smart move is you announce this big pot of cash. And of course, you include in that big $50 billion a whole lot of money that you've already sort of allocated or spent. So it's actually a little bit less than that $50 billion. But what he has done is he's given himself a bit of wriggle room. There is that $20 billion unallocated. He can decide what to do with that. Now, we are coming up to an election, but it also does mean that Grant can decide as the actual economy adjusts and we get a better read on what jobs are being lost, what industries are still impacted, to start to target a bit more of that funding. So quite a smart move having that residual left over.
Thanks, Brad. Kirk, just a question really from me about infrastructure. I know prior to and during the last period, you and your members have been talking a lot about the necessity for infrastructure spend, where it should be spent, how it should be spent. Do you think that the budget did enough to, was the investment enough? Was it targeted enough? And do you think we need to spend more?
Look, a series of good questions there, John. Is it going to be enough? That's the challenge with I think with infrastructure spending, and the government sort of announced $3 billion for infrastructure, predominantly through using the existing provincial growth fund in the budget. My view is really the key thing about infrastructure spending is it needs to be strategic. And we'll have to shift away from simply being jobs orientated in infrastructure development to saying, how will this infrastructure provide productivity for the economy? So I think there's going to be a point at which we have to say something which is useful to provide jobs now may be less useful if it's non-strategic in the future. And that's sort of one of the challenges around how the money is spent that Heather alluded to. We have to really make sure that we keep a keep a focus and orientation on how that is being spent, and that it's linked back into, you know, the really important work the Infrastructure Commission is doing about our infrastructure, not just for today, tomorrow, but over the next 30 years. So linking those things is going to be super critical, and I think an opportunity for business to keep the government's feet to the fire.
Thanks, Kirk. Yeah, look, I couldn't agree more with that sentiment. Look, much of the budget is directed towards supporting businesses and jobs through the worst effects of COVID-19, including recession we're undoubtedly already in. And the government's response and recovery funds some $62 billion across the next 4.5 years. Notably, some of those areas to focus on wage subsidy extension too is going to cost $3.2 billion. That's what's been declared. Already 11 billion spent on wage subsidies. I suspect some of that reserve, that next tranche of funding, could include more wage subsidies. Infrastructure allocated, we've just spoke about, 3 billion on top of the 12 billion. 5 billion borrowed for housing, for an additional 8,000 homes. We'll really look forward to those actually getting up and built. And I think I heard Kirk made a really important point on there that, you know, I think we've got to change our methodology here. You know, modular built houses, they work in a lot of countries around the world. We just don't seem to have made them work as well as we could here in New Zealand, and I think that's a good opportunity. In addition, government's injected significant funding into traditional areas, health, 5.6 billion, education, 800 million. So my next question really is to Heather. Do you feel the government is firing its fiscal bazooka in the right direction? Are they justified in borrowing the amount that they're talking about to invest in these big ticket items?
John, I'm going to answer this question politically, as in, is it the right thing to do for the electorate? Does the voter feel that this is the right thing to do? And I think yes. Reason I say that is if you look at those big ticket items that you just rattled off, so wage subsidy, right, that saves jobs, infrastructure, regardless of what that actually ends up meaning, most people will immediately think roads, 5 billion for state houses. Well, we know that there is a housing crisis. So I think that that's all justified in the public's mind, regardless of how much money is spent on it. And you know, add to it the health and the education. I mean, I think this part of this government, the coalition government's done a really good job of seeding the idea, the narrative that that all of these areas have been underfunded by the previous administration. So I think there is an appetite to see it funded, as well as that, of course, we know that our crown debt levels have been really low. So I think people understand we're in a good position to be taking on a little bit more debt. And I think also, you know, there is a generational difference here. I think previous generations to perhaps mine have been a little bit more afraid of debt than we are. And so there is, you know, it isn't kind of the negative thing that it may have been in the past. I mean, we've all kind of bought into the idea that New Zealand is, we could debate it, but whether New Zealand is actually in a good place to take on more debt. So I think the government has done the right thing here. And in fact, I think we'll be praised for it. I mean, you know, having gone through the GFC and all of those kinds of recent crises, understanding that pumping money into the economy is what made it better for us. I think this is exactly the response that most people will be wanting to see. So in terms of taking on more debt, putting it into these areas, how does that sit politically? It is the right political response.
Thanks, Heather. Some great thoughts there. Next one to you, Brad. I mean, will these initiatives make the difference? Do you think these large items like spending on defence and provincial growth fund crowded out further support for things like tourism industry or boosting working for families, etc.? So questions are really about, has the spending hit the mark in the certain areas? We know our planes are over 50 years old. We know, you know, we need those sorts of things, but is that the right time to spend the money on those sorts of things now?
I think what the government did make quite clear, John, was that you know, it's the right time to do them, to invest in some of the things, particularly around defence assets, because they are sort of in the state they are. You know, you could continue to sort of kick the can down the road, but that probably just sort of pushes out the issue. So given you're already taking on a huge amount more debt, there is sort of an argument, given how cheap it is, of you know, what's a few billion more, to a sense. I mean, the point I will pick up from Heather, though, is that she's right around the sort of that generational difference. And as the resident millennial Gen Zer in the room, or in the Zoom room, if you will, I think that is an issue we do need to grapple with, though, we are taking on a huge amount of debt here, and that is going to be passed on to future generations. Now, let's also remember that at the same time, most of the job losses we've currently seen, the stats show that's being felt disproportionately by young people. And I guess that focus on education and training, that there is one of the key areas that we get young people back into operations so they have the skills to actually meet the workforce. Just before we hopped on the call, Kirk was talking about the likes of those skills mismatches we have across the country. So I think we do start to address them. The one concern I do have, John, is how the government decides to spend this money. You know, the devil is in the detail. Now, if we have something like the Provincial Growth Fund as our mainstay of how we decide to spend money, the economy is going to crater, because at the moment we've had a huge amount of announcements from the PGF, and if you go around to local regions and ask them how much cash in hand they've got from government, the actual number is very, very small. So I think a real concern there about the rollout of some of these projects, and that's going to have to be something the government grapples with and makes quite clear. How does it get that money out the door quickly into communities, into businesses, and not just sit on its hands?
Thanks, Brad. I suppose the business reaction that I've seen to the budget has been generally supportive. I mean, in addition to the signature initiatives already mentioned, there was additional funding for NZTE to support exporters and small to medium businesses. There was support for e-commerce, increased R&D loans through Callaghan and Innovation. I mean, were there enough wins for the business in this year's budget? Kirk, is there enough to give business that have survived the last few months the confidence to continue and invest and grow?
Well, one of the observations that I make, in just referring to the conversation we were having before, a point that Brad made that, or actually probably in the start, that there was quite a comprehensive budget. The problem I've got with some of it is that it's quite low level spending. So I'll just give you a practical example. 10 million to train digital advisors and support SMEs getting into e-commerce. Like 10 million bucks is nothing. If you're going to try and make a transformational change within the small business community, that's going to need to be at least $250 million, I would have thought, to really upscale people's learning capabilities and digital skilling and make that shift away from kind of the very, very low productivity operational processes that many businesses still have. So that's really, that would be my observation. It's a good recovery budget, right? That's how I think business is thinking about it. And the question is, will there ever be enough in a recovery budget? The key thing is how quickly, as others have pointed out, the cash can get into the pocket of businesses where there are subsidies and employees, and business can get out of the way and enable economic growth to start happening again. In some ways, that $20 billion pot of money sitting there is a contingent fund for exactly that. If all of this current spending doesn't generate enough demand, they've got the ability to continue to try and create demand. But there will have to be a time when the government simply has to stop that and allow business to get on. So what I would say about it is that it's good for recovery. There could have been, as I said, some more strategic investment over a longer period of time, and maybe we'll see that. But the important thing is that now businesses are enabled to start to generate growth, and also given a very clear policy direction. And that's going to be tricky given we're coming into an election, I would have thought, because businesses aren't probably going to have a clear headline into what the current government's tax policy may be in terms of paying for this. So I think there's some challenges there. It's a good recovery budget.
Thanks, Kirk, and that's a nice segue into a question for Robyn. I mean, some commentators noted economic growth was slowing before the pandemic, hitting our shores, and government reforms over previous years pushing costs onto business. Is it enough that give in this budget from government to help businesses through the recession? Could they have done more with business tax settings or microeconomic policy reforms?
Yeah, I mean, whether you're happy with this budget from a business perspective probably also depends what sort of business that you're in, and whether you're on the receiving end of the financial bazooka that you mentioned earlier. If you were, then you'd probably be pretty happy with the budget. Like Kirk mentioned, that there's been a number of initiatives in there with varying amounts of funding to help businesses in different ways. So I think probably the onus now falls for the government to actually elaborate on what some of that spending is and how businesses can actually benefit from it, and also making sure that they don't get so caught up in red tape trying to actually get some of those benefits that it's not actually worth it for them. One of the pre-budget initiatives which are extended in here was the funding for NZTE. So Deloitte's been involved in running a lot of workshops for businesses through the NZTE scheme. So it's great to see an extension of that. I mean, one of the things that I would say is that it's just now is a time where businesses do actually need advisors and the support of people that can actually help them navigate through this. So having the funding there for professional support has been really great. In those workshops, you know, you be paired up with an advisor, you work through like the meaty problems facing the businesses as a result of COVID-19 and come out with a clear action plan of what those businesses need to be doing to plan and to move forward. So it's great to see funding there. Same as pre-budget, I think there was announced more funding for the likes of you guys to be able to, you know, provide the resources that you have for businesses. I mean, one of the things I haven't previously been involved with all of the organisations here, but just since COVID-19, just seeing the amount of sharing and generosity amongst New Zealanders and businesses in terms of navigating through the problems. I mean, there's a Business New Zealand Facebook group on COVID-19 that I joined, and just, I mean, as much as you can provide, have confidence in Facebook chat, but people are so generous in their times and like helping people, you know, just understanding wage subsidies and what do I do with level 2 and sharing all the resources and that sort of thing. So, I mean, for me, that's really positive. So many free webinars now, you know, nobody would need to pay for training ever again. Anyway, so returning also perhaps more to your question and my favourite topic of tax. I mean, certainly from my perspective, there wasn't a lot in there from a tax perspective, and I think that was definitely the right decision. We don't want to be in a position of we've already had a lot of tax reform this year, like more than in my entire lifetime probably. So not doing anything else to taxes at the moment, I think, is the right decision. And it'll just be a case of, well, what happens going forward? Should we be looking at increasing taxes to pay for this? I would say that's probably not the right idea, and I'm sure Kirk would agree with that. It's about having a vision in terms of how are we going to get out of the spending hole that we've created.
Thanks, Robyn. Look, that leads, I suppose, into my next question. As with all budgets, and you know, this is a big one, but as with all budget, there's still a lot of people, organisation and entities that are disappointed that that their areas particularly missed out. I mean, the tourism industry is probably the one that was first off the rank, was disappointed at the level of direct support. That's one example. I mean, other commenters has expressed surprise at the lack of commercial rent relief support. And again, that's one that we seem to have been waiting for, and we've not actually heard anything about that. I mean, I'll go back to you again, Robyn. Which areas are disappointing for you, and did you think deserved more attention in yesterday's budget? And what would you change?
I wouldn't say I was necessarily disappointed in anything, because there was just so much. I was sitting in the lockup with Brad yesterday. It was just information everywhere. It's like, oh my God, money here, everybody's a winner. Probably what I would say is just the lack of detail in terms of, you know, what this money actually means and where it's going and how you get it. That's probably, and that's just this is just a time thing. So it's also about, you know, making sure there is a discipline of getting the information out about how people can access the funding that's been allocated. In relation to tourism, I know, and probably everything in general, if you follow, I get news feeds, and like every budget day, it's just a non-stop stream of press releases that come through my mailbox of, you know, disappointed. I would have hoped that there'd be less people that were disappointed than compared to a normal budget, but you know, people like to be disappointed. Probably the thing that people need to remember is, you know, Grant's regularly used phrase, this is a rolling mall of initiatives. I mean, budget 2020 isn't the be all and end all, and there's going to be more initiatives. And so I think they specifically said in relation to tourism that this is just the first thing. Okay, the $400 million that they've allocated to this tourism recovery fund is just the first thing. They're creating this new tourism sector recovery plan and creating a tourism task force. And so I guess having the right people on that task force to come up with a plan and then, you know, come up with second, third, fourth phases to help the tourism industry is probably what is more important. And, you know, what of that remaining 20 billion goes to that sector. Going to commercial rents, I mean, yeah, I've been asked a lot of, everybody's like, you said that there was something coming on commercial rents. I'm like, that's just what the Minister of Finance said on a BusinessNZ webinar. He said it would be out in 2 weeks and it was 6 weeks ago. So yeah, I mean, it would be great to see something because everybody is just waiting to see. But yeah, obviously it's complicated. So yeah, I don't know. But I look forward to seeing what happens with the other 20 billion.
Okay, I won't press you on the issue of the commercial rent. I might come back to Kirk on it, but I won't press you, Robyn. Heather, what areas do you think government will struggle to achieve its rebuilding rhetoric in, and where would you like to see more investment to push the economy forward?
Right, I'll answer that. 2 questions, so I'll answer them separately. So struggling to achieve the rebuilding, I think most notably, I mean, the obvious thing obviously is going to be the infrastructure, right? So a lot has been made of this money. And remember, we've got the 12 billion that was announced earlier this year. So we've got 12 billion plus the 3 billion. So it's quite a bit of money to be pumping into projects. No details in this budget about what is being announced, where this money is going to go. I think they're going to struggle with that. For people, for voters, rebuilding is going to literally be seeing shovels in the ground and wanting to see that. Now, I think that they're okay for this election because I think obviously, I mean, I would be inclined to say this one's in the bag for them short of something really going quite badly wrong with their response. It'll be the next election, and by that stage, I imagine they voters. I mean, by that stage, that's a long time from now. So we will be seeing the shovels in the ground by then. But I think that is going to be a difficulty for them because obviously we have constraints in construction, and that is historic, and it's going to take quite a bit to change that up. Add to that the migration problem that we've got at the moment, and that'll really compound it. Which brings me to, I think, my second point. Where would I like to see investment? I'm less interested in investment and much more interested in this government just getting out of the way a wee bit of private businesses' attempts to rebuild themselves and get themselves going again. So where I'd like to see a little bit of assistance from this government actually is in just making it easier to do that. So cut the regulation. If what they're doing with the RMA is kind of a good start, head in that direction. Try and get rid of the regulation that is causing problems for businesses, and particularly around the border. And I really can't stress this enough. That's really problematic now. So I know that, for example, the universities have been calling for the ability to be able to bring international students in. They've gone to the government with quarantine facilities and a plan for how to do it, and they're still getting no luck by the looks of things. So I'd like to see the government really put some effort into facilitating that. If these guys can do it and can prove that they can bring these students in, that's a huge amount of money that would be able to pump into the economy just like that, without any investment from this government. Same for private firms that will need skills from offshore, and I'm particularly thinking of construction here, but it's much wider across the economy. The ability to bring people in to fill those skills shortages. We can pretend that the New Zealand workforce can fill it, but we can't. It's not possible. So I think they're going to have to start thinking immediately, very, very quickly, about how to start bringing people back in so that we can basically, without a huge spend from the government in terms of investment, we can actually start the wheels turning again pretty easily.
Thanks, Heather. Moving on, I mean, again, stating the obvious, the red ink is eye-watering. Finance Minister Grant Robertson deliberately broke his budget responsibility rules from 2017 because this is the rainy day of that the government has been preparing for. One could say it's been prepared for preceding governments have helped prepare it. The budget predicts deficits of almost 30 billion for each of the next 3 years, meaning the government's total debt rising to some 64% of GDP by 2023. Heather, back over to you. Obviously, we are in a crisis, but do you think the government has made the sort of trade-offs and hard decisions necessary to limit the fiscal damage?
No, not at all. I mean, the mere fact that, goodness, like, let's put this in perspective, right? 20 billion bucks that has been left over potentially to spend, yes, in part, I mean, let's not be too cynical, in part for actually keeping this crisis management going, and also in part for the election. That is what, like 6 times the usual budget's new spending. So it is an enormous amount of money. Plus what has been shoveled out in this budget is that it is huge amounts of money. And while I think a lot of it is justified, I do think also that I mean, when you have that kind of money, clearly it is more a case of just shoveling it out rather than thinking about, okay, where is the best place to put this? I don't think the government has yet made those trade-offs, but I don't think, and I think they've got the luxury of the fact that they don't have to, because nobody expects them to. And I think we're all being reasonably practical here and understanding this is a fast evolving thing. We haven't seen anything like this in a really, really long time. And, we have to cut them a bit of slack. There will be a bit of kind of wanton spending occasionally. I think that at some stage, though, we all know the pain is coming. I think that for your average punter, I don't think they've probably thought this through yet. But, to Robyn's point, the tax is going to have to come at some stage. The Prime Minister's already ruled out a capital gains tax again. They're going to have to, Cameron Baggery keeps saying they'll have to slaughter a sacred cow at some stage. And they're really going to have to. The Prime Minister cannot rule out everything that is going to help us pay this back at some stage. She has ruled out attracting high net worth individuals into this country. She has ruled out the capital gains tax. She has ruled out raising the age of superannuation. At some stage, some of those things are going to have to be ruled back in so we can pay for it. They have the luxury, obviously, of probably having this election in the bag. So they've got some time to be able to maybe, hopefully, manage the political fallout of that. But those decisions haven't been made by any stretch of the imagination yet, and they're coming.
Thanks, Heather, which actually leads me to Kirk, who I think really well qualified to speculate on this, having been a member of the tax working group. Obviously, this money has got to be paid for at some time in the future. As Heather's already said, there's lots being ruled out, but actually lots have been ruled out, but the door's been left wide open, I think, at the same time. Where do you think taxes should be focused, and how? And what do you think the business community would think, apart from saying we don't want any tax increases? But look, let's be realistic. We have to top the coffers back up again. What do you think is a sensible approach?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, largely there is a bit of a blueprint for addressing economic crises, and there's a lot of information available from the GFC, right, and how economies responded. So 86% of low and middle income economies and 84% of high income economies responded by actually cutting taxes and increasing spending as a result of an economic crisis over the GFC. So counterintuitively, the idea about paying this back doesn't come for a very, very long time, multi-generationally, if at all, I would say. Rather, the approach has been to enable future governments to continue to borrow by maintaining a debt to GDP ratio, which is acceptable to credit rating agencies. Now, how do you do that without, really tanking the economy? Well, what you do is you get out of the way and enable economic growth to occur. That's pretty much what most economies did after the GFC. So their debt to GDP is reduced simply by increasing economic growth. That is the GDP part of it. Now you can do that if you can stimulate a lot of economic activity really fast, and that has some consequences as well. And it'd be interesting to hear kind of Brad's view about this, because what will happen is then you start to get into real practical issues of some of the things that we saw as we started to come into COVID. That is real constraints on the supply of labor, real constraints in the supply of some of our goods, and supply chains. And then you have inflation. And so you have to deal with a whole range of other challenges. But my very firm perspective about it is, as we come out of this, the idea would be to pause, not to suddenly start to tax the hell out of everything, although we would have to have a pretty sound look at some taxes. There's no doubt about it, because of course there's also some of the government services that need to continue to be funded. But by and large, the reality would be and the view would be, and this is not just me, this is a reasonably internationally comparable set of data that you try and grow out of these things.
Brad, do you just want to pick up on that question and add to what Kirk said?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's right. And I think, Heather made the good point as well, that we are going to have to think about what our current settings are. Look, if we are imagining a New Zealand economy, what other sort of changes do we have to come in? And I guess the key point there is how do we get people moving? It's not a new question in many respects. I mean, Kirk's quite right that we were grappling with some of these issues as we came into the downturn. And actually, even before COVID came through, some of the larger issues around New Zealand's productivity was a real struggle. So the government's doing the heavy lifting in the short term. If we don't sort of allow businesses to operate over the longer term, though, we won't get that sort of sustained activity. So very much that focus on how do we break down some of those barriers, how do we let businesses just get on with doing business is going to be important as we move through.
Thanks, Brad. Final topic for me before we open it up to questions and answers from the audience. And I have to say, audience, that's the least number of questions I've seen for a Zoom that I've done recently. It's either we've got a great bunch of presenters here who've answered all of your questions, or you've still got some sleep in your eyes. So come on, guys, I need more questions. So final topic for this morning is the economy and where it's heading over the next few years. Treasury is forecasting GDP to decline 4.6% this year, but be surging back the year after next to an 8.6% growth in 2022. I mean, that's something that we've only ever seen out of the Asian tigers. Similarly, it is forecasting unemployment to climb to 9.8 before quickly reverting to normal levels by 2023. I mean, for Treasury, that's pretty optimistic forecasting. Brad, where do you think that sits? What do you think about that?
I think it's very optimistic, and I think it's simply not going to bear out. Treasury's in a hard place, right? You know, trying to forecast something like this, really, we're throwing out the rule book as economists as to how you forecast. We're looking at something like the Great Depression of the 1930s for how we determine what might come through. I think that the area that I'm most concerned about when we look at Treasury's expectations, but also the likes of the Reserve Banks, is we do bounce back to normal in their sort of scenarios. And I guess if I look around and I talk to people out there, I just don't see how we could have 250,000 people out of work, and then all of a sudden within 2 years we're all back to normal. That seems wildly optimistic and just not in keeping with what you hear from businesses out there. In my mind, it is going to be a much longer ride. And I guess the concern, John, is that if businesses are looking at these Treasury estimates and going, oh, we'll be sweet within 2 years, that's going to change how they plan it. And I guess our expectations from an independent forecasting point of view, if you will, is probably more of a 3.5 year time frame before we start to get the economy moving. Now, I'd very much like to be wrong and it be a much quicker recovery. But I look out there at the disruptions and I guess the reorientation of the economy, and I don't see it coming back quite as quickly. Tourism will not be the same in New Zealand as we move through. Retail will not be the same. If we're changing the economic foundations, we don't just bounce back to normal. And that's my concern over the speed that some people think New Zealand can come back from this.
Thanks, Brad. Very insightful. Robyn, what's your feeling on the predictions?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd agree with Brad in terms of it is extremely optimistic. I'm not a big numbers person, but in terms of understanding how the Treasury has come up with this, but my understanding is all predicated on an assumption that the borders are opening in March 21, which implies that there's a vaccine and that is that realistic? I mean, it would be great if it was, but that's not what I read in the news in terms of the likely time frame for it. I guess also businesses are still likely to be wary for a period of time, as much as, like what Brad said, or if the Treasury is saying we're going to be back to, 9% GDP or whatever it is by 2021, 2022, I should be more positive and I should just go out and hire more people and start spending more stuff. I'm just not sure that that's going to be happening. And really it just depends on where do we go with all of the restrictions that are currently on people, like how long are we going to be in level 2? There's different impacts on different people, and it impacts on everybody's behavior. And even just looking at this week, this is day 2 of level 2. There's not a lot of people around. People have got used to staying at home. So what's that going to, if the workforce is going to be more permanently changed to be more home based, then what does that do for like CPD and cafes and just general confidence and spending and all of that sort of thing? It'll be interesting to see how it plays off. And yeah, so that's my answer in terms of the global economy. Your guess is as good as mine.
Okay.
I won't waste the audience time on my speculation.
Thanks, Robyn. Well, what we'll do now, we'll open up, and yes, the audience has really come alive. We now got questions and answers, so we'll crack into them. First question: what does the panel think about providing tourism vouchers for the population to assist the industry while providing respite to the population? Interesting concept. So, who wants to get there? Heather, we haven't heard from you for a few minutes.
Thanks very much. I think it's a really nice idea. I'm always really wary of anything that creates an artificial industry, and I think it was Brad was just making the point that things have changed, in a way that we can't understand it, in a way that it will never go back. So I don't see the point. Well, while I hate the idea that there are going to be tourism operators who fall over, and I really hate the idea that there are going to be bars and hospitals falling over, because I love bars. Be honest about it. I want all of them to survive. But the fact is, we're just going to have to be brutal about it. This is one of the things, to go back to, questions about whether the government has made the tough choices yet. The hospo industry cannot be propped up indefinitely, the tourism industry, nor can it, because what's the end point? At what point do we, how long do we prop them up for before we finally say, okay, things are just not going to go back to the way that we may have thought they would? I mean, take, for example, the Asian market that we're so reliant on for tourism. Those guys don't necessarily behave in a way that we might consider to be rational for how a Kiwi might behave. I mean, we're all gagging to get out of the country and go touring again, but they are much more aware of disease and the implications of getting sick and whatnot. And so for them, this may actually be the kind of thing that puts them off international tourism for a wee while. And that's the market that we're looking to get. So while I think it's a good idea, and while I would love us to be able to prop up the domestic tourism industry, I just think we just end up in an artificial situation, and I don't think that's where we want to be spending our cash.
Thanks, Heather. Really good, comprehensive answer. Next question. I mean, hospitality had hoped for more support. It looks like the government is okay to see about 30% of hospitality businesses go under, and then try and redeploy 60,000 unemployed staff in other areas. Do you see some scope for hospitality to get some of the remaining 20 billion to support us until a later date? Obviously, that's from a hospitality operator. So who wants to kick in here? Kirk.
Oh, good one. Thanks, John. Give me the hard question. Look, my observation about hospitals, it's been actually really hard done by, to be perfectly frank. The two sectors that were doing it really hard before COVID, before the lockdown, were hospitality and tourism, because a lot of the market had fallen away. A lot of the traditional foot traffic market in certain tourism areas had fallen away for hospitality providers. So they've been in trouble, or having no revenue for more than 3 months, so more than a quarter, which is incredibly challenging. I think what the hospitality sector has done to try and help itself, and this is a credit to them, they went out and developed a strategy for recovery. Now that is really important. They can take that plan to the government and really push hard to say, we don't expect all our operators to survive, but here's our plan for how we see our future as an industry. And I think for any industry that is struggling, that's what they probably need to be doing. They need to be drawing on all of their current networks and getting networked if they're not networked, and then drawing on the skills and business brains of the people within those industries to say, okay, guys, how is it going to play out for us? What sort of support would we more directly need as an industry, knowing that, you know, there are going to be people who won't survive in any case? And what does recovery really look like for getting businesses that have failed, getting some of those businesses back into the market again? What sort of demand are we going to need, and how can the government support driving some of that demand, acknowledging it's also going to come from businesses and communities? So in terms of just getting the certainty and consistency for people to want to go out and spend money. So that'd be my observation about hospo. I mean, as I say, I think it's been really hard done by. I'm in Heather's camp. As people know me, I like to have a drink occasionally, and I've got lots of friends in that industry, and it's going to be tough for them. And I do think they actually need more specific support because they have been harder hit. And also, I'll just make an observation that I think the government doesn't want to take this sector for granted. It is our shop front window to the world. So if we do open back up to the world, we're going to need these businesses to provide, you know, good service, good food and beverage, which is what they are renowned for. You know, we're a great place to come to, but we're a great place to have food, and we're renowned for our beer and wine now. So we want to have people enjoying that. If we don't have an industry, we're not going to have that, and that's critical. Also, it provides tons and tons of jobs. So, and yes, there will be some moral judgment about the quality of those jobs, but that's frankly bullshit. Absolutely important coming out of this recovery is that there's jobs, you know, and I don't want to hear any moral judgments about the type of job that it is. I think it's that will be for the person who has the job or doesn't have the job to make, not for you know, commentators to call about.
Great, thank you for that, Kirk. I mean, obviously something you're passionate about there. And so the next one. Actually, sorry, the questions keep jumping around here. Now, I think this is a question for Robyn. I know you're not in the auditing side of your profession, but again, you have financial disciplines. How does the budget? Sorry, hang on, my questions keep jumping here. In terms of control over the $20 billion leftover fund, what oversights should there be, and how will we ensure that money is spent, not ensured it's spent on the right thing, but if you like, that there is the way it's spent, how it's spent, and the or is it just up to Grant to make sure that that's spent in way that he sees fit? Robyn.
Yeah, I think it's probably just a matter of putting in some processes and rigor around it, just to make sure there is transparency about where the money's going, that there is some sort of real sort of comprehensive thinking before money is just sprayed around. I think we're seeing more task forces being created, so like the tourism task force. As long as you're getting a mixture of like public and private input into it, then hopefully that will help ensure that it's being spent in the right way. I haven't watched it, but there's the pandemic committee of Parliament. I think they should have a key role also in just, you know, monitoring what is actually happening and making sure that, you know, the quality of the spending is good and it's not just throwing money away.
Thanks, Robyn. Next question, and I think we'll slow this one in Brad's direction. What's the panel's take, or in your case, you represented the panel, Brad, on the primary sector? Did it receive the sort of funding and support it needs to keep, you know, churning out those exports and earning overseas revenue for us?
I don't think it received too much specifically. I mean, obviously there was a bit of money there to combat M. bovis going forward. I guess what we did see though was nothing new to stop it from operating, which we have sort of heard overtunes coming out from the government in recent years around some of the environmental sticks they were happy to throw, but there wasn't as many carrots coming down the pipeline, I guess. And in that respect, I mean, if you look at our exports at the moment, sure, there's a bit of softness, but compared to other parts of the world, we are doing really well. The globe needs to eat, and we're able to provide that. So I think what the budget did yesterday was not throw any more hindrances at the export sector. It did give, of course, a little bit more of a focus to NZTE and their ability to provide advice as we look to those overseas markets. I think one of the areas we might have to focus on, though, John, as we move forward is, and it goes back a little bit to those sort of tax and transfer settings we've got, if we're going to impose additional obligations on farmers and on our agri sector, for example, I think this is an opportunity where we need to start providing more carrots than sticks, because we need the primary sector to keep operating, but we need to look after the environment. Previously, in my mind, it's been too heavily weighted to throwing, to really hitting farmers and telling them they're not doing a good job. Instead, I think we should say, look, we'll invest in you so that you can keep providing, but we achieve the environmental benefits too. It's not an either or, it's an and situation.
Thanks, Brad. I mean, I think the other thing to obviously comment is there has been infrastructure spend flagged for water storage and those sorts of things, which of course, particularly from a horticulture point of view, is one of the biggest things that they need. Now, next question is, and it picks up on Brad's, as the youngest on the panel, I think was what you said, Brad, something like that. Sorry, questions jumped around again. Got it now. Does the panel see some intergenerational squeeze as older workforce, with often the skills needed, are under pressure to retire, major changes for their roles into mentoring, coaching younger people? And again, could there have been done more work to support maybe older people moving into that role whilst in the workforce and then being linked to younger people? Heather?
Yeah, I'll be honest with you. I'm not an expert on how to use older people in the workforce, but I will say this, right? I know that this is something that is being considered already by business mentors, where they are acutely aware of the fact that we have an aging workforce and that we are likely to see older workers already feeling vulnerable, especially with unemployment going up and potentially even, being pushed out the door in favour of the younger workers. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me to do that, given that they have the experience that you need, having seen a number of crises most likely beforehand, and they are the ones with the work ethic and whatnot. And we already know how bad millennials are, sorry, Brad, but terrible workers, I hear terrible. What I would say is there is an increasing, what I'm worried about in another sense though, is this increasing attempt, and it seems a bizarre thing to do, to put a wedge between the generations. And you're seeing it coming through in the commentary already. This is a disease that, it's a baby boomer disease, and young people are paying for it in the future for keeping them alive. And I think that that's just really destructive. There is no need to be doing that kind of thing. We're all in this together. And so I find that kind of commentary that has been rolling out over the past few years really worrying. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that is basically what my thoughts on that subject are.
Thanks, Heather. No, that's really good feedback and good answer. Kirk, do you want to just give your perspective on that? Because again, close to business, you know what's happening in business. And Kirk, what's your thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good actually suggestion that the person's made, that we think about and have mechanisms for enabling people to stay in the workforce, but stay in the workforce in a different way. We know that we have skills gaps. We know that actually workplace training has been quite undervalued in the education system, and this would be a really good way to continue to use the skills and have that recognised, from a funding perspective for skills development, because of course that's a big component of the budget, and it's going to be a big component of how we shift and transition our economy going forward, right across the board, education and reskilling. So enabling, parts of the population that might want to stay in the workforce, but want to stay in the workforce in a different way, and enabling them to participate by upskilling young people would be a really smart thing to do, I think. And I, as I'm a TEC board member, and this is some of the things that government and the government institutions are really looking at about how they re-engineer the education system so that it's more responsive.
Thanks, Kirk. Well, guys, we've only got about 3 minutes left. Why don't I ask the panel just to wrap up any concluding comments that they might have around what we've experienced in the last couple of days and maybe what we've got to look forward to. And then what I would say for those questions that haven't been answered, we've got a record of them. We'll actually float them around our panel and just get them to make observations and then send them through to you by email afterwards. So we'll do that. So concluding feedback. Robyn, why don't you kick off?
Yeah, I mean, I guess from my perspective, like the last 2 months has probably been the busiest 2 months of my life. So if nothing else, COVID-19, it presents a whole lot of opportunities. Like there's a whole move where people can like start doing things digitally. If nobody had Zoom before, now everybody's got Zoom. Everybody's learning to do things in different ways. So yeah, I'm just looking forward to continuing to be busy and seeing what's next in the rolling mall.
Thanks very much, Robyn. Heather.
Look, what I would say is this is a really hard thing for us to go through as an economy and as a world, but I continue to be an optimist here and hope that what happens is that it shakes us down a wee bit, separates the wheat from the chaff. I don't know if it's chaff or chaff. I keep having this argument with my husband. And that hopefully that what comes out of this is a really clear idea of what New Zealand looks like, the strongest New Zealand possible, and we build on that. Two, because we're talking to the Wellington Chamber of Commerce here, I've had the misfortune of being locked down in Auckland for the last 2 months. I swear to God, the hardest thing has been knowing that I can't come home to Wellington. I'm coming home to Wellington tomorrow. I'm beyond excited about it. And I just want to say, we live in a fantastic city. You go around the country, you look at other cities, and it reminds you of how wonderful Wellington is. Yes, the weather is terrible. Everybody keeps telling us that, but we're all there for a reason. And I just think, let's just keep pushing on with the city because it is great. It shouldn't be forgotten, and it will actually come out of this better, and we're very lucky to live in it.
Thank you very much, Heather. Brad?
Yeah, I sort of want to pick up on that optimism there. Look, economists are generally a pretty pessimistic bunch. That's almost our job title. Find any hole you can and sort of pick it apart. I am optimistic, though. I'm optimistic about how New Zealand can move forward from this. We're in a good position. We've got these sort of structural supports coming through from the government now, and we need to let businesses get on with it. I mean, we've seen a huge amount of change, and I think that number 8 wire thinking is going to come through very clearly in New Zealand. When the pandemic happened, when we got locked down, people found a new way to operate. Every time your boss said you can't work from home, you now I was working from my ironing board. We've had all these people who've rapidly changed. So when they were a cafe, they're now figuring out a new way to deliver. They've never had to do that before. We're changing very rapidly, and I think that innovative thinking is the thing that's going to get us through, and that's what gives me the confidence. As we continue to move through, we're going to see an incredible amount of pain, but we are going to get through this.
Thanks, Brad. And finally, Kirk.
Yeah. Well, I concur with what others have said. I mean, we went hard and early. As a business community, it was a really tough decision, I think, for the government to lock the country down. But in doing so, we were supportive because it would give us the best economic chance to come out of COVID as strongly as possible from an economic perspective. So my comment would be we nailed the health crisis. Now let's really nail I guess the economic recovery part of that. And from a budget perspective, I think the government have given business a pretty good chance at that.
Thanks very much, Kirk. That wraps up our presentation today, our webinar. I'd like to thank all of the panellists. I think a really great bunch of people who've given a really good perspectives on the budget comprehensively. As is the way with the Wellington Chamber of Commerce, as you know, when we have guest speakers and that, we always reward them with a bottle of Atarangi. And I can tell you I'm actually coming out of lockdown tomorrow, driving 10 k's away and picking up a case, and there will be a bottle on the way to you to refresh your cellars. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Hope you've enjoyed it, got some value from this. One, just to remind you that we actually have the Honourable Simon Bridges on with us later today on a webinar, who's going to tell us his view of the budget and perhaps how National would have done it different. So look forward to seeing you later today. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Have a great rest of the day, and more importantly, have a great weekend. And Heather, we look forward to seeing you in Wellington. Thanks very much.